The black stallion's hooves thundered against the wooden fence with bone-jarring force, sending splinters flying as Maverick Creed dove sideways to avoid being trampled. Dust clouds billowed around the corral as the beast reared again, eyes wild. With fury, while onlookers scattered like leaves in a windstorm, "That's enough." The sharp command cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Maverick rolled to his feet, spitting dirt, to see a woman striding toward the fence with the confidence of someone who owned not just the horse, but likely half the territory. Her auburn hair caught the morning sun beneath a weathered hat, and her emerald eyes blazed with an intensity that made the stallion's rage look tame. "Ma'am, I can handle," Maverick started, brushing dust from his leather chaps. "Handle what? Getting yourself killed in my corral?" The gate with fluid grace, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The stallion, named Thunder's Revenge, immediately backed away from her approach, though his muscles remained coiled like steel springs. "That horse has sent 3 so-called cowboys to the doctor this month." Maverick straightened, his jaw tightening. At 32, he'd broken more horses than most men had ridden. From the wild mustangs of Nevada to the war horses of the cavalry. His reputation had carried him to this remote Colorado settlement, where whispers spoke of an impossible horse and the widow who dared any man to tame it. "Your advertisement said $500 to whoever could break Thunder's Revenge," he said, pulling his hat lower against the glare. "Didn't mention the owner would interfere?" Cordelia's laugh held no humor. "Interfere? Mister, I'm trying to save your hide. That stallion killed my husband 2 years ago, threw him against these very fence posts." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the pain beneath her tough exterior. "Since then, he's been nothing but a beautiful demon, and I've been fool enough to keep hoping someone could reach him." The crowd that had gathered to watch another cowboy attempt the impossible began to murmur among themselves. This was better entertainment than the traveling shows that occasionally passed through. Copper Ridge. Maverick studied the woman before him, the proud set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like she was carrying the weight of the world, the slight tremor in her hands that she thought no one would notice. "What if I could?" he asked quietly, his tone losing its earlier bravado. "What if I could gentle him without breaking his spirit?" Cordelia's eyes narrowed. "Stood in that corral has said the same thing. They all end up eating dirt or worse. But none of them understood what that horse is really fighting," Maverick said, watching as Thunder's Revenge paced the far end of the corral, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat. "He's not just wild, he's grieving. Lost his rider. Lost his purpose? Sound familiar?" The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Cordelia felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she wasn't prepared for. This dusty stranger saw something the others had missed, something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge about herself. "You've got until sunset," she said finally, "but I'm staying right here to watch. When that horse puts you in the ground, at least someone will be able to tell your story." As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Maverick entered the corral with nothing but a coiled rope and a patience that seemed to radiate from his very bones. Thunder's Revenge watched him with eyes that held intelligence and pain in equal measure, the stallion's breath coming in sharp snorts that spoke of barely contained violence. "Easy there, beautiful," Maverick murmured, not moving toward the horse but simply standing his ground. "I know what it's like to lose everything that mattered." Cordelia found herself leaning against the fence, drawn in despite her skepticism. Most men had charged straight at Thunder's Revenge with whips, spurs, and determination. This cowboy seemed content to simply exist in the same space, as if he had all the time in the world. The stallion pawed the ground, sending up small dust devils, but didn't charge. Instead, he seemed to be studying this strange human who neither advanced nor retreated. Minutes stretched like hours as the two beings took each other's measure, while the gathered crowd grew restless. "Nothing's happening," muttered old Pete from the mercantile. "This fella's just standing there like a fence post." But Cordelia saw more. She saw the subtle way Maverick's shoulders relaxed, how his breathing slowed to match some rhythm only he could hear. She saw Thunder's Revenge's ears flick forward with curiosity instead of aggression, the way the horse's stance shifted from defensive to wary interest. "Tell me about him," Maverick said, without turning toward her, his voice barely carrying over the fence. "What was he like before?" The question caught Cordelia off guard. No one had asked about Thunder's revenge as anything other than a problem to be solved. He was magnificent, she found herself saying. Josiah raised him from a Colt spent hours teaching him to respond to the lightest touch. They moved together like they shared the same soul. And after, Cordelia's throat tightened. After, he became something else. Wild, angry, dangerous. Like he blamed everyone for what happened, including himself. Maverick nodded slowly, finally, taking a single step forward. Thunder's revenge tensed, but didn't bolt. Grief can make a creature do terrible things, he said. Can make them push away anyone who tries to get close, hurt anyone who reminds them of what they lost. The words hit Cordelia like a physical blow. She realized he wasn't just talking about the horse anymore, and the knowledge made her want to flee, but something kept her rooted to the spot, watching as this stranger worked some kind of magic she couldn't understand. Thunder's revenge took a tentative step forward, then another. The crowd held its collective breath as horse and man drew closer, neither rushing, neither backing down. When the stallion was close enough to touch, Maverick slowly extended his hand, palm up, offering rather than demanding. "That's it," he whispered. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." The horse's muzzle dropped toward his hand, and for one perfect moment, trust flickered between them like lightning. Then something, a shout from the crowd, a bird taking flight, shattered the spell. Thunder's revenge reared back with a scream of fury, hooves striking the air where Maverick's head had been a heartbeat before. But instead of running or fighting back, Maverick simply stepped away and resumed his patient stance. "It's all right, boy. We've got time." Cordelia felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed prick her eyes. She'd seen her husband work with difficult horses, but never like this, never with such profound understanding of what it meant to be broken. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, she found herself hoping, really hoping, for the first time in 2 years that maybe, just maybe, some things could be healed after all. The sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson when Thunder's revenge finally allowed Maverick to rest a hand on his neck. The moment stretched between them like a prayer answered. Both man and beast trembling with the weight of tentative trust. Cordelia pressed her hands against the fence rail so hard her knuckles went white. Around the corral, the crowd had grown. As word spread through Copper Ridge that something extraordinary was happening, but all she could see was the gentle way Maverick's fingers moved through the stallion's mane. The way Thunder's revenge's eyes had lost their wild edge and found something like peace. "I'll be damned," breathed Doc Henley, the town's physician who'd treated more than his share of cowboy injuries. "That horse is actually calming down." But Maverick wasn't done. With movements so slow they seemed like meditation, he began to work his way around Thunder's revenge, his hands never losing contact with the horse's coat. The stallion shivered but didn't pull away, as if some deep part of him remembered what it felt like to be touched with kindness instead of force. "You miss him too, don't you?" Maverick murmured, his voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness. "Miss the way things used to be, when the world made sense?" Cordelia's breath caught in her throat. She could see the exact moment when Thunder's revenge's resistance crumbled completely, not broken, but transformed. The horse turned his great head toward Maverick and rested it against the cowboy's shoulder with a sigh that seemed to carry 2 years of pent-up sorrow. "Sweet, merciful heaven," whispered Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house. "He's actually done it." But Maverick shook his head. "Not yet," he called out, his eyes finding Cordelia's across the corral. "This isn't about breaking him or taming him. It's about trust. And trust has to go both ways." Before anyone could ask what he meant, Maverick began backing away from Thunder's revenge, his hands raised in a gesture that was both surrender and invitation. The stallion watched him go, confusion flickering in his dark eyes. Then Maverick did something that made the crowd gasp in horror and wonder. He lay down in the dirt of the corral, flat on his back, completely vulnerable. Thunder's revenge could trample him to death with a single movement, and everyone present knew it. "What in tarnation?" old Pete started, but Cordelia's sharp gesture silenced him. She understood now what Maverick was doing, and it terrified and amazed her in equal measure. He was offering Thunder's revenge, a choice, trust or violence, healing or revenge. The same choice she'd been avoiding for 2 years, Thunder's revenge. Approached slowly, his hooves making soft sounds in the dirt. He sniffed at Maverick's still form, then stepped over him, standing protectively above the prone cowboy like a guardian rather than a threat. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark and the soft sound of the horse's breathing. Then Thunder's revenge lowered his great head and gently nuzzled Maverick's face. The gesture so tender it brought tears to more than one pair of eyes. Maverick sat up slowly, his hand coming to rest on the stallion's forehead. "There you are," he said softly. "There's the horse Josiah knew was in there all along." At the mention of her husband's name, Cordelia felt something break open inside her chest. Not painful, but like the first crack in winter ice that promises spring. She realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face, without shame or apology. Thunder's revenge seemed to sense the shift in her emotions. He lifted his head from Maverick and looked directly at her, and in his eyes, she saw not the wild fury that had haunted her dreams, but recognition, forgiveness, an invitation to stop running from the past and start building something new. The crowd began to disperse as full darkness settled over the mountains, their voices filled with wonder and disbelief. But Cordelia remained at the fence, watching as Maverick ran his hands along Thunder's revenge's neck one final time before stepping away. "Your $500 is in the house," she called out, her voice hoarse with emotion. Maverick looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. "Keep it," he said finally. "I didn't do this for the money." "Then why?" "Because," he said, walking toward the gate, "sometimes the most broken things just need someone to believe they can be whole again." The next morning found Cordelia standing in her kitchen, staring at a pot of coffee that had long since grown cold.
Ow!
Sleep had eluded her, her mind replaying every moment of the previous day, not just Thunder's revenge's transformation, but the way Maverick Creed had looked at her when he'd spoken about broken things being made whole. A soft knock at her back door made her jump. Through the gingham curtains, she could see Maverick's familiar silhouette, hat in hand. Her heart did something foolish and complicated as she opened the door. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle quality he'd used with Thunder's revenge. "I wanted to check on how the horse was doing." "He's different," she admitted, gesturing toward the corral where Thunder's revenge stood peacefully, no longer pacing like a caged storm. "I haven't seen him this calm since," she stopped herself, unwilling to finish the sentence. "Since Josiah," Maverick said gently. "It's all right to say his name, you know. Forgetting isn't the same as healing." Cordelia turned away, busying herself with reheating the coffee. "You seem to know a lot about healing, Mr. Creed. What makes you such an expert?" "Lost my wife and son in a fever outbreak 3 years back," he said simply, settling into one of her kitchen chairs without invitation. The casual familiarity should have annoyed her, but instead it felt oddly comforting. "Spent the better part of 2 years trying to drink myself to death before I realized they wouldn't want that for me." The confession hit her like cold water. She turned to study his face, seeing now the lines around his eyes that spoke of deep sorrow weathered into acceptance. "I'm sorry." "So am I, but sorry doesn't bring them back, and it doesn't honor what we had together." He accepted the cup of coffee she offered with a nod of thanks. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is learn to live again, not despite our grief, but alongside it." Cordelia sank into the chair across from him, her own cup warming her hands. "The whole town thinks I'm crazy for keeping Thunder's revenge. They say I should have put him down after what happened, but you couldn't?" "No," the word came out as barely a whisper. "Killing him would have been like killing the last piece of Josiah I had left, even if that piece was angry and wild and dangerous." Maverick reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. The contact sent warmth shooting up her arm, and she realized with a start that it was the first time a man had touched her with gentleness since her husband's death. "He's not the last piece of Josiah," Maverick said quietly. "The love you shared, the life you built together, the woman you became because of it, that's all still here. He touched his free hand to her heart. Thunder's revenge was just carrying your grief because you were afraid to feel it yourself. The truth of his words broke something loose inside her, and suddenly she was sobbing, great wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. Maverick didn't try to shush her or offer empty platitudes. He simply held her hand and let her cry until the storm passed. When she finally looked up, her eyes red and puffy, she found him watching her with such tenderness it made her breath catch. "I must look a fright," she said, attempting a watery smile. "You look beautiful," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "You look alive." Before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Thunder's revenge at the corral gate, whinnying urgently. But this wasn't the sound of distress they'd grown accustomed to. It was something else entirely. They rushed outside to find the stallion pawing at the gate latch, his dark eyes fixed on something in the distance. Following his gaze, Cordelia gasped. A small band of wild horses had appeared on the ridge overlooking her property. Their leader, a beautiful paint mare, calling back to Thunder's revenge with clear invitation. "They want him to come with them," Cordelia breathed, understanding flooding through her. He could be free. Maverick studied the scene, then looked at her with questions in his eyes. "What do you want to do?" It was the first time in 2 years anyone had asked her what she wanted, and the weight of choice felt both terrifying and liberating. She looked at Thunder's revenge, then at the wild horses on the ridge, then at the man standing beside her who had somehow become important to her in the space of a single day. "I want," she said slowly, "to stop being afraid of letting go." With trembling hands, Cordelia reached for the gate latch. Thunder's revenge watched her every movement, his ears pricked forward with keen intelligence. When the gate swung open, he didn't bolt as she'd expected. Instead, he stepped through slowly, then turned back to look at her with eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of understanding. "Go on," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Go be what you were meant to be." But Thunder's revenge surprised them both. Instead of galloping toward the wild herd, he approached Cordelia with deliberate steps. When he reached her, he lowered his great head and rested his forehead against her chest, a gesture so gentle and final it felt like forgiveness made manifest. "Thank you," she breathed into his mane, "for carrying what I couldn't, for waiting until I was ready to let you go." The stallion pulled back and looked at her one last time, then turned toward Maverick. The two regarded each other with the respect of beings who had shared something profound. Maverick reached out and placed his hand on Thunder's revenge's neck. "Take care of yourself, beautiful," he murmured. "And remember, being free doesn't mean being alone." As if he understood every word, Thunder's revenge tossed his head once, then wheeled away and galloped toward the ridge with a joy that was breathtaking to behold. The wild horses welcomed him with nickering calls and playful nips, and within moments, the entire herd was flowing across the landscape like liquid lightning. Cordelia and Maverick stood side by side, watching until the horses disappeared over the horizon. The silence that followed felt different from the oppressive quiet that had haunted her ranch for 2 years. This was peaceful, complete, full of possibilities. "I should probably head on," Maverick said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "My work here is done." Cordelia felt panic flutter in her chest. "Where will you go?" "Wherever the wind takes me, I suppose." "There are always horses that need gentling, people that need," he stopped, studying her face. "Why?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Cordelia thought about the empty house behind them, the ranch that had felt more like a tomb than a home. The way Maverick's presence had awakened something in her she'd thought was buried forever. "Because," she said, stepping closer to him, "I think maybe I need gentling too." Maverick's breath caught. "Cordelia, ... I know it's been 1 day," she rushed on, afraid she'd lose her courage. "I know it's crazy and fast and probably foolish. But I also know that for the first time in 2 years, I feel like I'm waking up from a long, dark sleep. I feel like maybe I could learn to be happy again, and you think I could help with that?" "I think," she said, reaching up to touch his face with wonder, "we could help each other." Maverick caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek. "I'm not him," he said quietly. "I can't replace what you lost. I don't want you to replace it," Cordelia replied. "I want you to help me build something new, something that honors what came before, while embracing what could be." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, full of questions and hesitation. But as Cordelia melted against him, as Maverick's arms came around her like she was something precious and fragile, it deepened into something that spoke of healing and hope and the courage to love again. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Maverick rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "Just these hands, this heart, and a willingness to stay and see what we can build together." "That's more than enough," Cordelia whispered. "That's everything." In the distance, a meadowlark called out its liquid song, and somewhere on the wind, they could swear they heard the joyful neighing of a horse who had finally found his freedom. The ranch that had felt like a monument to loss suddenly felt like a foundation for something beautiful and new. "So," Maverick said, pulling back to look at her with eyes that sparkled with mischief, "think you can handle having a cowboy around the place permanently?" Cordelia laughed, the sound bright and unfettered. "Well," she said, echoing the challenge that had brought them together, "I suppose we'll have to see if you can really call yourself a cowboy after all." 3 months later, the transformation of the Whitmore Ranch was nothing short of miraculous. Where once there had been an air of abandonment and sorrow, now there was bustling activity and the sound of laughter. Maverick had proven himself worth his salt in ways that went far beyond his gift with horses. He'd mended fences, repaired the barn roof, and somehow coaxed life back into Cordelia's neglected vegetable garden. But the most remarkable change was in Cordelia herself. The woman who had once moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own life now sang while she worked, her green eyes bright with purpose and joy. The townspeople of Copper Ridge watched the courtship unfold with fascination and approval, though they were careful to give the couple their privacy. "Never seen anything like it," Doc Henley remarked to his wife over breakfast. "It's like watching two people come back from the dead." Indeed, Maverick and Cordelia had found in each other not just love, but a kind of salvation. They worked side by side during the day, training horses that came from neighboring ranches. Word of Maverick's gift had spread. They were never short of clients. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch swing Maverick had built, talking about everything and nothing while the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold. On this particular morning, Cordelia was hanging laundry when she spotted a familiar figure on the horizon. Her heart leaped as she recognized Thunder's Revenge, but he wasn't alone. Beside him ran the paint mare from that first day, and trailing behind them were 2 young foals, one black as midnight like his father, the other painted in browns and whites like his mother. "Maverick," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. "Come quick." He emerged from the barn, a bridle in his hands, and followed her gaze to the ridge. A slow smile spread across his face as he took in the sight of the stallion who had brought them together, now clearly thriving in his wild life. Thunder's Revenge seemed to sense their attention. He raised his head and let out a call that echoed across the valley. Not a challenge or a cry of pain, but something that sounded remarkably like joy. Then, to their amazement, he began to descend toward the ranch, his family following. "What's he doing?" Cordelia whispered, her hand finding Maverick's. "I think," Maverick said with wonder, "he's come to introduce us to his children." The wild horses approached to within 50 yards of the house, close enough for Cordelia and Maverick to clearly see the intelligence in Thunder's Revenge's eyes, the protective way he positioned himself between his family and the humans. The foals, curious and fearless, as only the young can be, ventured closer, earning gentle nickers of warning from their parents. For nearly an hour, the two families regarded each other across the space between wild and tame, free and settled. It felt like a blessing, a benediction on the life Cordelia and Maverick were building together. Finally, Thunder's Revenge approached alone, stopping just outside the reach of human hands. He looked directly at Cordelia, and she could swear she saw gratitude in his dark eyes, gratitude for letting him go, for understanding what he needed to be whole. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The stallion bobbed his head once, as if he understood, then turned and rejoined his family. Within moments, they were flowing back up the ridge like poetry in motion, leaving behind only hoofprints and a sense of completion. Maverick squeezed Cordelia's hand. "Feel like a good omen to you?" "It's the best," she agreed, then turned to face him fully. What she saw in his expression made her pulse quicken. "Maverick, what is it?" He released her hand and reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing a small carved wooden box. Cordelia's breath caught as he dropped to one knee in the dirt of their yard. Surrounded by the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of horses, "Cordelia." "Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I came to this place broken and lost, carrying grief I thought would never heal. You and that impossible horse of yours taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to love again, deeper and truer than before." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, worn smooth and beautiful with age. "This was my grandmother's ring. It's not much, but it's been in my family for 3 generations, and I can't think of anyone more worthy to wear it." Tears were streaming down Cordelia's face now, but she made no move to wipe them away. "Maverick, I'm asking you to marry me," he continued, "not because either of us needs saving, because we're stronger together than apart. Because we've learned that the heart has room for all kinds of love, the love we've lost and the love we've found. Will you be my wife, Cordelia? Will you help me build a life that honors both our pasts and embraces our future?" The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning when the aspens were dressed in gold and the air carried the promise of winter. The entire population of Copper Ridge turned out for the ceremony, held in the very corral where Maverick had first gentled Thunder's revenge. Someone had strung lanterns between the fence posts. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with a feast that groaned under the weight of everyone's best dishes. Cordelia stood at the altar, really just an arch of pine boughs decorated with late-season wildflowers, wearing her mother's cream-colored dress, altered to fit her curves. But it was her face that took everyone's breath away. She glowed with a happiness so radiant it seemed to light the entire gathering from within. Maverick waited for her in his best suit, the one he'd bought in Denver years ago for his first wedding. But this felt nothing like that young man's nervous anticipation. This felt like coming home to himself, like stepping into the life he was always meant to live. Pastor Mackenzie, who had traveled from the county seat for the occasion, cleared his throat and smiled at the assembled crowd. "Dearly beloved," he began, but was interrupted by a sound that made everyone turn toward the ridge. Thunder's Revenge stood silhouetted against the morning sky, his wild family arrayed behind him. As if summoned by some invisible signal, he lifted his head and called out a wild, joyous sound that seemed to bless the proceedings with all the freedom and fierce love of the untamed world. "Well," Pastor Mackenzie chuckled, "I believe we have divine approval." The ceremony proceeded with laughter and tears in equal measure. When Maverick and Cordelia spoke their vows, words they had written themselves, full of promises about weathering storms together and celebrating joys doubled by sharing. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. "I promise to love you with the same gentleness you showed my broken heart," Cordelia vowed, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I promise to trust you with my fears and share with you my dreams. I promise to build with you a love that's strong enough to honor what we've lost and brave enough to embrace what we've found." Maverick's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. "I promise to be your partner in all things," he said, his hands steady as they held hers. "I promise to gentle your sorrows and celebrate your joys. I promise to love you with everything I am, for all the days of my life, and to never let you forget how precious you are." When Pastor Mackenzie pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted of salt tears and sweet promises. The crowd erupted in cheers, and somewhere in the distance, Thunder's Revenge called out once more, for disappearing over the ridge with his family. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. There was dancing to the music of Old Pete's fiddle and young Tommy Henderson's guitar. There was enough food to feed half the territory, and there were toasts that grew increasingly creative as the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed. But eventually, the guests began to drift home, leaving the newlyweds alone under a canopy of stars that seemed to shine with extra brilliance. Maverick had carried Cordelia over the threshold of what was now their home, and they sat together on the porch swing, her head on his shoulder, both of them marveling at the strange and wonderful turns life could take. "Do you think Thunder's revenge knew?" Cordelia asked sleepily. "That he was bringing us together that first day?" Maverick considered this, absently stroking her hair. "I think horses know things we don't." He sensed we were both lost and needed finding, and now, Maverick said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "I think we're exactly where we belong." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the wild places beyond civilization, a black stallion grazed peacefully with his family, his work complete. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with contentment, and two hearts that had thought themselves beyond healing beat in perfect rhythm. Testament to the truth that love, the right kind of love, could indeed conquer. All as they sat together in the darkness, surrounded by the vast beauty of the American West. Cordelia and Maverick knew that their real adventure was just beginning. They had learned that sometimes the most broken things, when touched by patience and understanding, could become the most beautiful. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, a wild horse could teach you everything you needed to know about letting go, holding on, and the courage to love again.